Hey everybody, this is the Debrief presented by BrightHire. The series you're turned into is Masters of Sales Hiring, featuring top sales leaders sharing lessons learned from building world-class sales teams. I'm your host, Teddy Chestnut, co-founder of BrightHire, and today I am so thrilled to be joined by Holly Proctor. Holly's the SVP and Global Head of Sales at Clari, previously led sales teams at WeWork and LinkedIn, was a former boss of mine way back in the day. So this is like a really fun reunion and homecoming for me. Holly, thank you so much for letting me rope you into this today.
For sure. Thank you for having me. What a treat to think that I was going to sit here with Teddy Chestnut running a company that is just crushing it and talking about a topic we love. So pumped to get into some talent stuff with you.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right into it. You have helped scale teams in very different contexts: LinkedIn, WeWork, Clari. And I'm really curious. We always talk about like the ideal seller profile, right? The characteristics and attributes of people that you look for when you're hiring for AEs that do remarkably well. I'm just really interested in those different kinds of environments. What have you learned about what's the same and what's different? Right? How much has stayed consistent? How much is different in those environments in terms of what's made great people truly great?
Yeah, it's a great question. I had a flawed point of view on this when I was at LinkedIn, which is a great seller is a great seller. And so move them around, doesn't matter. You sort of have these innate instincts and things about you that drive you to success. And I'm sure there's some commonalities across all environments, but leave it to WeWork to change my point of view on lots of things. And one of which was this. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that's different about selling real estate that is different about selling software is that you're working on basically on an inventory, right? There's only a certain number of offices. There's only a certain number of space available in that location. And so you are running a totally different urgency playbook than you are in software, right? And so if you don't run that urgency playbook differently in real estate than you do in software, it's such a missed opportunity. So you think about it, you've got two potential buyers that show up to a building tour. Only one of them could actually take that space. And so if you're not using that to your advantage and running a playbook around urgency, what a miss, right? And that's not the case that you're running inside of software, right? The way that you think about urgency is totally different. And so, the person that could drive urgency really effectively in a way that didn't feel salesy, but instead felt like there was a fear of missing out on something that you were really into, it became one of the things that I hired for the most inside of WeWork, which I haven't thought about since, right? Because it's such a different scenario. And so it was a really good, I can share several examples on sort of what the key characteristics are of different, segments and such inside of different environments. But that one thing really stood out to me as something I had never thought about in software, and all of a sudden became nearly my number one criteria. And so as you think about, it was a good reminder to me to sort of pause inside of every new company and every new environment and consider what is required for that thing.
That makes a ton of sense. I hadn't thought about it like that. LinkedIn, when you left, was, I don't know, what, 15,000 people, maybe more. Clari, when you joined, was how big?
Clary was 400 people when I joined. We're about 1,000 now.
Got it. 400 people, and so maybe half of those sellers ish,
Yep.
a couple hundred sellers. So
Yep.
what about that difference, right? Again, back to like AE profile, things that you looked for. What were there big differences between 200 and maybe 7,000? Right? Like what?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, totally. So obviously in that case, we're still talking about software, right? So it's not that the environment is markedly different, but we are at a different stage of company. And the reason why the stage of company matters is because, where LinkedIn was, is LinkedIn was a household name. My grandparents, isn't it you that said your grandparents thought it would work for Lincoln, the car company?
No, but that's a good
No,
one.
not you, someone else. Okay, most people would say LinkedIn is a household name. Maybe not my grandparents, but LinkedIn was a household name. Everybody knew it, right? And so you weren't educating a market, right? The market was educated. They knew who you were and what you did. And so you needed to educate them on the solutions you offered. You needed to educate them on the products that you were recommending. But ultimately, you weren't like educating them on what LinkedIn did. That
Yeah.
was not true of Clary, probably even still today, depending on the buyer and the industry, right? And so the amount of sort of market education that you're doing as a seller in this world is fundamentally different. And so that means that you have somebody that has to have some patience in their sales process. One of the things we've found is like 60 to 70% of our opportunities that we ultimately win have a close loss opportunity. So we had to try several times before we ultimately won, right? That's probably not true of LinkedIn anymore, right? You're sort of at this place where most companies are a customer and you're thinking about the expansion profile. And so the market education and sort of the patience required to join this stage of company. And if you think about, I'm sure you've studied this given, who you are, but I love the crossing the chasm stuff. And if you think about applying sort of a seller profile to crossing the chasm and sort of where you are you pre-majority? Are you, where do you fall? And the role of the seller varies depending on where the company fits in that profile. So that's one thing that changed when I think about the Clari profile.
So like strategic patience and persistence. Let's go win a deal that we lost before. Is there anything in particular that you can think about, either when you were, thinking about the first cohort of AEs that you had your hands on bringing into Clari, or then now the leaders who are bringing in frontline folks? Anything in the interview or hiring process, profile interview questions that's really tuned into to selecting for those attributes like patience, persistence?
Yeah. So one of them is how they classify wins in their business. So I'll give you a different. So a win for your sort of classic traditional salesperson who is beyond where Clari is, let's call it late stage, has crossed the chasm. A win is bookings, right? It's closed won revenue, right? It's really cut and dry. And you would assume that should be the case for most salespeople. The difference when you are building something from scratch is a win is not always measured in revenue, as you very well know, right? A win might be, somebody responds to your email. A win might be that you come up with a new talk track that resonates really well with an industry, right? A win is measured pretty differently for that profile of seller. And so I'll give an example. We've just built out a new verticals team and focused on healthcare, life sciences, and consulting professional services. And so usually we're B2B tech. And so now as we transition into these new industries, the type of profile, I don't really expect them to close a ton of revenue in their first year or two, right? Like they're building a business from scratch. And so if the only thing they consider a win is bookings, they're going to feel like a failure for a while. And so I need them to feel accomplished by something else, right? Like the concept of defining a point of view or landing a narrative or, whatever.
That's fascinating. And so in the interview process, are you testing that just by asking, like, tell me about your wins as a seller? It's just an open-ended question, or you do?
Here's one other way is, okay, so I've been really transparent on what the makeup of the job is, right? It's not your traditional sort of AE job. You know what you're trying to build. And so at the end of this year, what does success look like to you? And so if they say, I've crushed my quota, I hope they crush their quota. I really hope they crush their quota for lots of reasons. But in the event they don't, there's got to be some other stuff in there.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, we were just talking about like, what do you need to hire for the role that somebody's going to do and be successful in today? But I know that you're super passionate about hiring for people who can grow to become leaders tomorrow. How do you think about that translating into your approach to hiring for like potential versus experience? I'll phrase it another way. Mike Campson, who we both know, talked about like hiring for people who can hit the ground running versus hiring for people who can run really far. Like, how do you think about that in terms of how you approach interviewing and hiring?
Yeah. This might be another Gamsonism, but this is, I'm sure you've heard this, like, as we thought about, fast or rewind, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, when you and I first started working together, one of the programs that LinkedIn was standing up was, around this MBA profile where we wanted to hire some really smart people and they probably didn't have sales experience, but they had an aspiration to go into sales. And so the sort of nomenclature we used was they could do anything and they choose to do sales, right? And so it was, we're completely avoiding by design the number one thing you'd normally hire for, which was sales experience, right? And that was by design, right? Because we were looking for other things. And so as you think about, sort of similar to your question, as you think about potential versus experience and how do you weigh the two, probably the area I think about this the most is in leadership candidates, right? So people that aspire to be leaders. And I'll tell you a couple things that we can maybe talk about external candidates and then internal candidates. When I think about internal, There's two things I've used throughout my career that, as if I've ever deviated from, I regret very quickly. And
Hmm.
so it's become sort of a bulletproof formula for me on internal promotions into leadership roles. The first is this nomenclature of, is it clear and obvious? And so what I mean by that, if I were to announce tomorrow, so and so is the next leader of this segment, would anybody be surprised? Would the body reject the organ? And not that it's a popularity contest, it's certainly not a democracy, but if the people are sort of like scratching their heads thinking like, well, that's an interesting hire, that's a signal to you as a leader that that person hasn't shown up as a leader already in their current role. And that's the benefit of hiring from within, is that you have exposure, you have data on what they do today
Right.
and how they show up. So that's sort of criteria number one. Number two is, are they already operating in that capacity that should make the leap in this jump of experience pretty minimal? So for example, like, have you already roped them into interviewing? Do they already have a point of view on how to assess talent? Do they lead your team meetings? Do they play a role that sort of looks and feels like a leader already? They're sort of walking like a duck and talking like a duck. Therefore, as they get promoted to a duck, it's not that foreign, you know?
Promoted to a duck. That's a good phrase.
Right? So that's
And what?
internal.
Yeah,
Is that helpful?
it's super helpful. Clear and obvious, and they're doing the job already. It's
Yeah.
easier when you have a lot of surface area on somebody and they've had a lot of opportunity, but obviously less so external. What are the
Totally.
considerations there?
Yeah, external less so for sure. And so when you make the bet on performance versus potential, I think you're looking for just other pieces of data. So, for example, I would struggle probably to hire somebody who hadn't had leadership experience into a leadership role for the first time. And that's one of the bets that people make. And so I think usually what you're thinking about is mostly when you think about ICs who don't have a traditional background. And so I'll share an example. When I came back to Clari and I was came to Clari back into software, there was a bunch of people from WeWork I wanted to bring, right? There was a bunch of really talented people that I was eager to bring with me, and none of them had software experience. And so naturally, I got this not extreme pushback because I work for an amazing leader who is supportive of my decision making, but there's definitely an open question of like, should they have software experience? Do you think it's going to translate? And then one of the things that I appreciated most is as we wrapped up last year, two of our club performers, two of our top attainment reps were WeWork alumni who that was our first year selling in software. And so, it was again, like sort of, and this is, I guess, the takeaway is how do you translate the ingredients that you see inside of them to the environment that they're walking into?
I'm going to ask a question which might be the opposite of that, which is around blind spots. Maybe that is one where people don't see that skills can really naturally transfer from one environment to another. But I'm curious your take. What are the biggest blind spots that either you've uncovered for yourself or that you've witnessed among other leaders as you've approached hiring for sales reps?
Yeah, we referenced this a little bit earlier, but the mistake I made at LinkedIn where I sort of felt like a good seller is a good seller, agnostic of the environment. I've pulled some people over with me that didn't translate well to the new environment. And so that's really hard because they're people that you sought after to recruit, right? They're people you likely have a very good relationship with and that you love and respect, right? So then when things don't work in the new environment, you still have to uphold the performance standard that you have for your new environment. But there's more, at stake because of the relationship. And so that's a really difficult lesson because it's really painful to course correct.
What are the checks that you would put in place now thinking about, having felt that pain? And that's like tough, visceral pain because, again, people you care about a lot, and one of the benefits of, hey, I step into a role and you're supposed to like, hey, I got a bench of people who are going to come with me and they're going to follow me, right? That's like part of the sell, right?
Yeah.
So what are the checks that you would put in place to make sure that you don't end up in that spot?
Yeah. One of the things that I think is so important, and I actually remember Gamson doing this at some point in his LinkedIn career, is if you're the leader of the function and you pass on a referral, by default, everyone assumes that that's a fast track hire. right? If Holly says this is somebody we should hire and Holly is the leader of this function, then like they're in. And so their spidey sense of like, one, do they even critically assess them? I don't know. And two,
Right.
their spidey sense they're pushing down because they sort of feel like they're overridden already. And so I think it's so critical to give the the pre-read on the person. That is, I actively want you to critically assess for fit, right? I am consciously aware that I might have a bias, right? And so I want you to assume that this candidate has no attachment to me, right? And so like assess them, it maybe even worse, right? That like, because of how painful it would be to separate, I want you to even dig in further, right? Which is ensure that there's, a 90% chance of success with this hire. And so I think that step alone probably goes really far in ensuring that the leaders, on your team can apply their traditional process to assessing talent without the bias that you might have, unknowingly cast.
I think what you called out there ties to like one of the biggest challenges for communication among leadership, which is just thinking that it happened when it hadn't. And most leaders probably would think, of course, assess this person super critically, and I want you to really put them through the ringer. But if they don't say it explicitly, then it's not communicated and it's not internalized in that way.
Totally. Yes.
We've talked a bit about interviewing in a couple different contexts, for leadership, for potential, in different contexts. One of the biggest challenges, especially in sales, is like people can just show up as good interviewers. Like, how have you kind of pushed or probed or coached other hiring managers that now work under you to really try to differentiate between somebody who can show up as a good interviewer and who's actually going to really show up in the job?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would love Bright Hire's point of view on the thing I'm about to say and like your point of view specifically. So I don't know. I'd love to hear what the current thinking is on reference checks, and I'll share where I'm going. So like, it is still a part of the process that I institute for several reasons. Naturally, it's easy to sort of game in that you're going to select the people that have the strongest point of view on you, but it's shocking to me how much information I've been able to garner from reference checks. And so it's still part of my process, even though I've gotten a lot of feedback that that's a little outdated. And so that would be sort of one of my sort of back pocket things there. What's the current thinking on reference checks?
Teddy, not as Bright Hire, but just as a leader, we do them all the time, 100%. And we have a very specific form that we like host in Notion with a set of rigorous questions that force a perspective. So when you'll ask somebody like, is this person more like this or more like that, right? Or what environment would they be good in versus not strong? Like, not like yes or no questions, not fluff. And I will say, like, I've run a number of reference checks with folks who've been, served up by their contacts. And the reference at the end was like, I've never been through such a deep reference check before. It's only half an hour, but if you really are super rigorous and thoughtful about it, you can get a ton out of that conversation. So yeah, that's our actual approach and take over here at Bright Hire.
Yeah. I love that. Yes, totally in line. I think that's hopefully one of the things that's relatively easy to do to sort of
last topic,
ensure that you don't get caught.
You mentioned in our pre to this discussion that you've got like team all over the world, right? So many different environments and cultures and countries. And then you all just did a study with Forrester talking about like expanding into new geographies and vertical markets as a huge priority. You talked about expanding vertically as well. How if you were to offer one or two pieces of advice around hiring into new markets, whether geographic or vertical, how does that impact your approach, right? The humility with which you approach that hiring, like what lessons learned have you learned kind of hiring in new markets?
Yeah, totally. Okay, I've got two. And I'll focus on our entry into APAC. And we made the decision to start in Australia. And two things that I learned. One is we knew we were going to go there. And so we knew a year in advance. Wow. And so we started recruiting for the first hire a year in advance. And so between my CRO and I, we met with more than 30 candidates, like final stage candidates, in trying to make that hire, because Pete Kim gave me some advice, which was, if they are, halfway around the world, they need to be, an extension of you, because your access to them is so minimal, right? You might only have an hour overlapping a day. And so they can't just like lean on you, and therefore you're going to influence a bunch of their stuff. They need to be able to operate on their own because you have such a limited ability to influence. And so we just we invested very deeply in that hire. And so when we started in advance, so that we could see a lot of options, right? And that we could ensure that we felt a high degree of confidence in the hire. So that was one. So we ended up hiring this guy named Abdul, who is incredible, probably one of the best hires we've made. And part of it is because there's such a unique profile in that this person is, an evangelist, right? They're the first boots on the ground in the market. And they need to play the role of, he's hired as the leader of the market, but yet he's doing so much SDR stuff and AE stuff and like all the things you do when you're the first hire, right? And so he's actually, very much an entrepreneur and establishing, a market from scratch. And so the ability to flex roles was so critical. And so the other thing that I learned from these 30 interviews was even if I didn't think that person was going to be a fit for the role, I leaned into helping them educate me on the market. And so, in the first 10 minutes, I might say, this isn't our person for reason X, Y, or Z, but it's still, somebody knowledgeable in the market. So for example, I got educated on the partner strategy in APAC through candidates. I asked every single candidate about how they used partners in APAC, and I got a wealth of knowledge. And so it was still a good use of my time, to invest in those candidates. So it was a really good learning lesson, and I was glad we were patient on that one.
Fascinating interviewing, two-way street, a lot of value in both directions. Holly Proctor, SVP, Global Head of Sales at Clari. Thank you so much for joining us. Super fun conversation. And you can catch us in the next episode of The Debrief, Massive Scale Hiring.